If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall unravel the mysteries surrounding necromancy, the discipline that allows one to manipulate ghosts and corpses. This episode will also focus on the road of bones and the path of death into the soul. Welcome back, child. It is almost a pleasure to welcome you once again into my domain after such a long absence. I dare say you were nearly missed. It would certainly explain the strange pain in my chest, although I am more than certain that is some form of indigestion. Anyway, I hope you managed to fulfill the task for our prince during your month in Edinburgh. More importantly, I hope you managed to collect those items from... yes, splendid work, neonate. Please put them over there. I will have Colin deal with those momentarily. Tell me, how is our esteemed Prince of Edinburgh these morbid nights? I trust you sent the Lord Camden my regards? Excellent work, child. I am pleased to see my teachings have not been totally wasted on you. I can see by the look in your eye that you have seen things that have troubled your soul. You hold a strange paleness that usually accompanies those that have seen... You have witnessed necromancy at work, haven't you? Your grandfather, you say? My condolences. You may keep such encounters to your chest if you so please, but it would seem we both for once share a mindset on the practical uses of such a discipline. Regardless of its application, there is nothing inherently moral about the use of necromancy. Disturbing the restless dead, be it corporeal or not, is such a macabre practice. Whilst I can see you have very little interest in pursuing such things further, perhaps I can share with you what I know on the subject of necromancy, and the strange individuals who focus their own lives on it. If anything, it can prepare you for the potential dangers ahead. Necromancy is a form of blood sorcery that specializes in the manipulations of the world of the dead, mostly consisting of the domination of ghosts and their homeland, what are often referred to as wraiths and the Shadowlands respectively, by members of our ilk in the know. Just as there are different styles of conventional thaumaturgy, there are a variety of necromantic paths which are mostly practiced by the Hecata, the clans and bloodlines of death that have spawned from the Cappadocians, including them also. Such younger members of this strange bloodline have recently started calling it Oblivion, which is also the same new name for the La Sombra's Obtenebration. The learning and progression of this discipline shares many similarities with other forms of blood sorcery. A tutor is required for the teaching of new paths and the powers within. Only with an intermediate understanding of the path can the kindred progress onto a new one. Any paths after the primary path are not greater in power than that of the primary path. Where it differs massively is that it is neither as fluid nor as quick as thaumaturgy. Not all necromantic powers are taught as disciplines, of course. Some require more than the forcing of one's will and blood to activate. I speak of the necromancy rituals or necromantic ceremonies who, like more common rituals, must be taught from one necromancer to another. The tutors available, however, are a hodgepodge bunch, to say the least. Most commonly to us, the sons and daughters of Cain, most teachers would be members of the Hecata bloodline. Most of the rituals under the school of necromancy were crafted by the Cappadocians through years of careful study and experimentation, but many of these rituals can only be taught by ghosts and sinister mages that claim the underworld as their domain. From my limited understanding of them, most allow the caster to see into the shroud and poke into the memories of the deceased. Some allow one to inflict horrible visions into the minds of others with the use of props most would prefix as gross, like mummified hands, eyes, and for fuck's sake, child, grab a bucket from the kitchen if you're going to heave blood onto my rug. Consider that your free taster session then, as you clearly do not have the stomach to take on the rest of my examples. Although, vomiting is probably the least of your worries. I was often warned of the dangers of poorly practicing necromantic rituals from my Cappadocian friend, God bless her soul. There are plenty of horror stories I could regale you with the horrific curses of unpleasant visages, incurable diseases, or perpetual haunting that could be inflicted upon the foolish Cainite. Similar things occur with any successful casting of the necromantic path that can greatly alter the environment as well as the person's health. I once witnessed plants in Prague becoming incredibly carnivorous following a particularly powerful necromancy power power, as well as an unintended animation of corpses. It was a particularly dreadful breach of the Masquerade, but totally fascinating all the same. I felt dreadfully ill for a good month, but this paled in comparison to the poor bastards that were the unsuspecting mortals. In short, the greater the evil power, the greater the risk. You may not know this, but necromancy was not always so inherently evil, at least not to the ancient Romans and Greeks. Necromancy was only a sinful practice if the necromancer forced the spirit to do his or her bidding. It was believed that this communion with the dead was a way to honor them, particularly the spirits of your ancestors. Such beliefs still hold in many modernized societies. A spiritual "I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine," so to speak. It is a relationship that fuels the Giovanni. I believe Augustus pays his respects to Dissipator, the Roman god of the underworld, but that is just something that I heard once many a moon ago. Necromancy would undergo some changes, as does all things in life, and unlife for that matter. Soon, the necromancers would summon the dead on their own terms, and they would be compelled to obey the spirits, thus becoming the dominant party for interactions with the dead. It was a legitimate practice that fell into disfavor once the Christians arrived, and necromancy became necromancy, or black magic. For the most part, it would be practiced by the then mortal Giovanni and the vampiric Cappadocians. The next shift in necromancy would occur when the Giovanni became vampires and Augustus discovered the concept of the endless night. In short, the Giovanni believe that with some 100 million souls, they will conduct the rite of the endless night, which will tear down the shroud between the afterlife and the mortal world. The necromancers believe that this will grant them control over the world and every soul within it, ceasing the differences between vampires and humans and freeing them of the laws of the beast. For an even shorter definition, it is an apocalyptic plot for Augustus to become a god, which is just a whole new level of terrifying to nag in the back of your head. As for the modern knights, it was explained to me that the Giovanni divide necromancy into two parts, the principle of authority and the principle of taboo. Authority was developed with reference on the cosmology of Lamplagius, some Arabian philosopher who classified gods, demons, and similar entities into a single hierarchy of beings that could be manipulated through the right use of symbols and cultic practices. As the ghosts of the dead occupied a lower place than the living, a necromancer could force these creatures to do their bidding, as God had given Adam and Eve dominion over the world. For these necromancers, raised were as much resources as wood and grain. Necromancers of this strain emphasized purity, chasteness, preciseness, and the use of objects with symbolic connotations to authority and enslavement. Taboo, on the contrary, does not rely on rules, but on the overstepping of them. Taboo-breaking necromancy persists that the rules of society have mystical properties that draw from the persons that observe them. Deliberately breaking these rules gives the necromancer power. The more sacrosanct the rule is, the more power can be gained from breaking it. Since contact with human remains is among the greatest taboos in the Western world, necromancers focused on bodily remains of the dead. Necromancers of this strain emphasize the use of objects that arouse disgust in the living, rotten flesh, maggots, grave dust, and similar things, as well as objects that are associated with concepts that are thought separate from death, youth, fertility, pleasure, and so forth. Acts like necrophilia are then used to break the taboo and power the practice. The principles of authority and taboo are very difficult to use conjointly. Most necromancers focus on one approach, which I will extrapolate later. I see you are still caught up, however, in the endless night idea. 100 million souls is certainly a big number. That is slightly less than the entire population of Ethiopia, I believe. So many languages and cultures to maintain and control, and the Giovanni are probably not that diverse, so how do necromancers do it? Well, regardless of where you are in the world, in order to summon a wraith to do thy bidding, one must have an item of great importance to them, like a redding wing, a stuffed bear, etc, etc. These are known as fetters, and by the way, these are Western examples, of course. There is still the potential language issue, but with enough hand gestures, modifications in vocal tone, and persistent swearing, one can convey the basic intent of the command. Isn't that right, child? As for the ghosts themselves, I lack information on how wraiths behave. My one source died many years ago, and the Cappadocians have since distanced themselves from me for reasons, but we'll get onto that later, so Hold on to that thought. On the topic of Cappadocians, their own path was considered very different from the necromancy of the Giovanni, which, remember, was once called necromancy, both of which were considered their own disciplines. The path practiced by the Cappadocians was called mortis, which allows one to manipulate the deadened body itself. The grave robbers believe when a person dies, the soul leaves the body, but an echo of the soul remains. This echo, along with the flesh of the dead, can be manipulated in many ways through its three paths. I would argue that the grave's decay is the most well known of these, but that is perhaps a little presumptuous of me. As the name implies, this path allows the necromancer to channel the dark powers of decay, ruin, and entropy into living and unliving individuals. Where there is a fascination with death, one must have life to balance it out, which is where the cadaverous animation enters, which is how the Cappadocians have animated the likes of skeletons, corpse serpents, and more throughout the Dark Ages. This would later become the Bone Path. Then you have the corpse in the monster, which is considered a sacred gateway between the living and the dead. The vampire can take on the properties of a corpse, either enhancing their endurance or reducing such traits at will. In the modern nights, all three of these would be considered their own paths under the umbrella patch of necromancy, as mortis is mostly certainly a defunct term. However, these paths, mostly corpse in the monster, would become thanatosis, which involves the manipulating the effects of death and decomposition, exploring the appearance of death in all of its forms, whether that is causing canines to lose their teeth or turn themselves into a thick, sticky, powdery mess. To that end, thanatosis is not really necromancy at its core, but it resembles necromancy enough for one to include it here, and despite the fact it is owned exclusively by the Samedi, the Giovanni are overly fascinated with this discipline and wish to learn its secret, and given the heated rivalry between the two bloodlines, you won't be surprised to learn that no Giovanni has learnt this discipline. Excluding thanatosis, these are the necromantic paths associated with the Cappadocians, but I can share with you that was not all they knew. They were weavers of information and deception, remember. I am certain that the Cappadocians shared many a unique necromancy path, probably lost to the sands of time thanks to their Italian offspring. I am only aware of one of these, and that is the Path of Skulls. To summarize, it is this path that allowed the Cappadocians to become political masterminds, as they are able to spy and plot against their opponents through the theft of identity and knowledge from the dead. Such Cappadocians would call themselves harbingers, so I suspect Prince Roger de Camden was behind its creation. Once known as necromancy, the Giovanni's main path of necromantic pursuit is known as the sepulchre path. This path abandons the study of flesh and concerns itself solely with the spirits of the dead. The mortal Giovanni families possessed this magic, be it one far removed from the Cainite thaumaturgy, but has since become an expression of the curse of Cain. Those that practice this necromantic path are to believe that the shroud, the plane of existence where wraiths are found, severs life from death, thus suspending between the two. The Giovanni know it is their blood that allows them to witness, summon, harm, and control ghosts, even forcing them to stay in a particular location, be it a room or a small box. I am informed that using said powers in the presence of something of importance to the wraith makes it more difficult to tame them. I initially believed this is to be exclusive to fetters, but it could also apply to the location where they died, such as the site where they crashed their car, or the car itself, or the tree in which they hanged themselves, for example. Complementing the sepulchre path is the ash path, which is perhaps one of the more perilous paths to learn, for it allows the necromancer to look and enter the underworld, with each power of this path increasing the necromancer's vulnerabilities to wraiths. At the same time, it is subtler than its aggressive cousin. On that note, I interviewed a Rossellini Giovanni who once spoke of the Path of Woe, which they described as a sacred art form, bearing some righteous support from mortal hunters, mainly the Inquisition, I was informed, that would enjoy the heretic souls suffer as they beg for absolution, the spirits I mean. The focus here is not with negotiation, but on torture. Oddly enough, this was not the first time I had heard of this path. Setites, Toreadors, and even the La Sombra have spoken to me on this dark art. The Path of Woe might have reminded you of Nihilistics of the Nagaraja, which is often referred to as the Virtuous Path. This allows the Canaanites to call forth the energies of Oblivion to attack or infect their opponent, either directly from Oblivion or from within themselves. It also allows these Canaanites to eat wraiths in replacement for blood. It is both ghastly and horrifying to behold. the literal opposites of virtuous. Once a variant of mortis called demios, you may have heard it as the path of the four humours, but the Lamiae titled it as the path of the Twilight Garden, which has a many Bahari reference. This necromantic path follows an interesting philosophical mindset surrounding the four humours split across two axes, hot and cold and wet and dry. Blood is hot and wet, phlegm is cold and wet, yellow bile is hot and dry, and black bile is cold and dry. When a mortal is ill, it was historically said that one of these was out of balance, and the healing process was meant to put them back into balance. You can probably see where this is going, but in case you are not, those who study this necromantic path believe that just like the Canaanites can tap into the potency of blood, one can do the same with these humours to perform an array of debilitating effects. It is a terrifying power to behold, a power that is almost exclusive to the Lamiae, as they guard their secrets close, only sharing those that come to venerate the Dark Mother. The path of the Cenotaph allows the Canaanite to become one with the Shroud, using their body as a conduit of sorts. This path can allow the Canaanite to determine whether a body has been tampered or touched by a ghost, identify fetters, which are items that are close to the deceased in order to summon the wraith in question, find the location of ghosts, or even create artificial fetters. It is said that the path of the Cenotaph and the path of haunting were both taught to the Giovanni by the Impedulu during our Dark Ages. The path of haunting, however, is quite different from the Cenotaph path. Whereas the former is used on the deceased, path of the haunting spooks the living by literally haunting them with visions of ghosts and malevolent spirits that can drive the target to their derangement, presuming they do not kill themselves beforehand. And one cannot mention the Impedulu without talking about the Mlawatu that some would become, and one cannot talk about the path of the Cenotaph and not mention the path of a Bombu. What makes it stand out, however, is its practice. The Liabon believe that they are an unnatural bridge connecting them to the Skin and Shadowlands, the realms of the living and the dead respectively, rather than just a ghostly tool. Many necromancers use their gift of the blood as a tool, but it's rather natural that such unnatural talents would degrade one's humanity, as one's perceptions on life and death are skewed even further as you poke and molest the restless dead, be it the spirits of the underworld or the secrets of the vampiric condition. As one may suspect, two different paths of enlightenment have just been teased before you. Both are very similar to each other on the surface, but far more complex with a bit more investigating. First you have the Road and Path of Bones, which is something I've indeed touched grounds upon with you before. It is Ashur's original goal taught to his clan. I see you remember this well, as you bloody well should, given how many times we have discussed the clans and bloodlines of death in great detail. Death is studied and defined when it occurs, and it is far deeper than just when the heart and brain stop. It is also the difference among the various causes and what lies beyond. It is finding comfort between life and death, distinguishing salvation and damnation, and removing the perverse moral kind and kindred standards. It often involves hastening death, should the delay of such be deemed unnecessary. It was intended by God, who said that death was the ultimate end of mortality. It is thus the duty of the followers of the Path of Bones to repay back a little of what has been stolen from death after mortals and kindred cheat death 100 times over. All that are blessed with the embrace die. You did, I did, and so have countless others. We have all experienced one of the greatest mortal mysteries. Or have we? Those that follow the Path of Bones believe it is the weird, unexplored middle ground that lies the key to understanding undeath. Unlife to the grave robbers is tertiary. One must remain calm and collected as one meditates upon their own studies. The beast can easily ruin centuries of work in just a few seconds. Some would be prepared to argue that the beast is actually the human element of the soul, a manifestation of one's frustration with the principles of life. Understand various necromantic paths are vital for progression along this road, and Auspex is far too powerful not to indulge in. Grave diggers searched for fragments of the Book of Nod and other historical artifacts to learn the truth, often tomb raiding for lack of a better phrase, to find more information, be it in an old crypt or some Tremere chantry. They care not for the Jihad. If the antediluvians exist, they are, to the gravediggers, a cosmic entity that will simply snuff out the universe. To that end, Gehenna is not the end, but the beginning. It is for this reason why tutors of this almost religious path are deceptively difficult to hunt down, as is a reliable haven to quietly pursue one's research. Gravediggers value discretion and secrecy, which is why zombies are used as assistants. They perform instructions correctly and keep their mouth shut, unlike you. It is assumed that most of the followers of the Path of Bones are Giovanni. This is true, but most Giovanni do not follow this path. It is an old relic of the past to most, that only exists tonight because it does indeed further the Giovanni motives of bringing about the endless nights. The few that do follow this path consider themselves as scientists and repositories of lore. Those that do not hoard and research from ancient books speak to it, acting as the Giovanni's primary liaison with wraiths. It is not uncommon to find members of Clan Malkavian, Tzimisce, and Tremere here also. Much of the Path of Bone ethics can apply to its darker cousin, the Path of Death and the Soul, but there are some major differences. The main differences can be found in their names. Where the Path of Bones focuses mostly on what happens in this world, the Path of Death and the Soul is death and beyond, poking into the underworld with the end goal to exist there, loathing existence in the mortal realm. The Giovanni hate these necromonists with a heated passion. The Giovanni are arrogant, believing they, and only they, are allowed to practice this dark art. You now see the other difference. The Path of Death and the Soul is primarily a Sabbat path of enlightenment. You would assume that it is the harbinger of skulls that compromise the largest portion of the followers of this path, but my research has informed me that it is actually the Cenotaph, with the Toreador Anti-Tribu a close second. Malkavians and Tremere, both in the Sabbat and the Camarilla, have also been known to dabble in this path also. The Path of Death and the Soul is far more scientific in its pursuit of answers to some of the ultimate questions. There is no talk of living and dead worlds, only the rational universe and the irrational realm of secret spirits and pain. They must develop a deep connection with themselves, their souls, to understand the irrational divinity that exists in the universe. They treasure intense emotions, interpreting them as the spirit bubbling from within, all the while giving off a cold and dead demeanour. When a vampire is staked, they are paralysed, which to the necromonists is a violation of the soul. The heart and the soul drive emotions, allowing them to move, think and feel via the blood of Cain. Therefore, the blood is life, a fountain of magic and might. Regardless of one's focus on science or religion or something in between, those that practice necromancy forces the practitioner to forever study and experiment every undead thing around them as they try and make sense of the world beyond them. Rituals are performed, atrocities are conjured, and countless undead lives are tortured just for the self-gain of the necromancer. As I said earlier this evening, there is no such thing as a good use of necromancy, especially when you descend into one of these paths and start poking around with Thinbloods and Cathians to pursue some obscure rumour. To that end, I wish to ask you a favour, the one I mentioned earlier in our discussion tonight. Yes, I am redeeming one of your two boons. The first was for saving you, the other was providing my domain as your temporary haven. This is not up for discussion. As you were probably made aware earlier tonight, we have some new neighbours moving in, a group of mortal researchers no less. Now, I would usually have them disposed before they can even so much thinking about screaming their dying breath, but it would appear we could find some use for them. It turns out that some fairy friends of mine have found out that these researchers are ghost hunters of sorts. They belong to a secret group called the Phoenix Institute, and appear to be quite knowledgeable on the inner workings of wraiths and their domains. I know you must think me mad to trust the cute whispers of some dormice and the curious desire to investigate the mortals camped not too far from here, but my sources tell me they know far too much. That case you returned with, the items I asked you to collect for me, various letters and documents should cement my proof that their knowledge of the underworld would challenge the most enthusiastic Hakata. Now, despite my best efforts, no vampire has managed to bestow me any satisfactory knowledge of the underworld, and I cannot use Dominate for I know not what to ask, and the use of one's telepathy is not as subtle as I would like it to be, so this is where you come in. Go to these mortals, pose as some lackey that wants to explore or hide and eavesdrop on the conversations, but I want to know everything. How they organize themselves, where do they live, what powers do they possess, their currency, everything, child. I must have this knowledge if I ever plan to surpass the puppets of Cain and prevent the endless nights. You will do this for me, otherwise you will end up with the wraiths in the Oblivion. Go forth, child. For your sake, you will not disappoint. To be kept updated, follow the Lord by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you will be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.